Ethan Brooks, a wealthy, power-hungry, and arrogant businessman, made a reckless bet that would forever change his life in ways he never anticipated. He thrived on competition, driven by a relentless need to prove himself superior in every aspect of life, whether in business or relationships. For Ethan, life was a game, and he never lost. That night, at a lavish party overlooking the glittering skyline of Chicago, surrounded by influential figures, champagne, and luxury, Ethan's best friend, Ryan Carter, presented him with a challenge. "Ethan," Ryan smirked, his voice dripping with mischief, "I bet you can't marry a woman who isn't your type. Someone who doesn't fit into your perfect, polished world." The crowd around them chuckled, but Ryan's words dug deep into Ethan's pride. Known for dating only the most beautiful and elegant women, Ethan felt his pride flare. No one dared question his courage or his ability to conquer any challenge. Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "And what's the prize?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with competitive fire. Ryan grinned, his eyes flashing with excitement. $1 million, he said, lifting his champagne glass. "But there's a catch. You have to marry her, and stay married, for at least 6 months." The room buzzed with interest, all eyes on Ethan. For a moment, he considered the absurdity of it. Marrying a woman just for a bet? It sounded ridiculous beneath him. But as always, the allure of the challenge was too tempting to resist. The thrill of victory, of proving once again that he was unbeatable, coursed through him. Ethan had never turned down a dare in his life, and this one wasn't about the money, it was about his ego. With a slow, deliberate nod, he agreed. "Deal," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the noise, confident and certain. He was ready to win. What Ethan didn't know was that the woman Ryan had in mind, Mara Collins, was nothing like the glamorous women he was used to. Mara was strong, independent, and didn't fit the conventional beauty standards Ethan surrounded himself with. But she was about to become the center of a game that was far more than just a bet. Days later, Ethan received a brief description of Mara. She wasn't just different in appearance. She was resilient, someone who had built her life on her own terms, far from the shallow world Ethan knew. This intrigued him. Used to having control, Ethan wondered how he would handle someone who wouldn't bend to his will. Their first meeting was arranged at a high-end restaurant in the city. Ethan arrived, expecting the usual, a woman dazzled by wealth and status, easily manipulated. But when Mara walked in, Ethan felt the air shift. She didn't flinch at the opulence, or at the man sitting across from her, exuding confidence. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, her voice clear and steady. "You must be Ethan Brooks," she said, as she sat down, unfazed by the grandeur of the setting. "And you must be Mara Collins," Ethan replied, offering a controlled smile, extending his hand. She hesitated briefly, then shook it with a firm grip, stronger than he expected. A subtle warning that she wasn't to be underestimated. "Let's not waste time," Mara began, her tone direct. "I know about the bet. The terms, the conditions. You don't need to pretend." Ethan was taken aback by her bluntness, but he masked it. "And yet you still agreed to meet," he countered, curious about her motivations. Mara paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I have my reasons," she said cryptically. "But if you think you can control me or play me like you do with everything else in your life, you're mistaken." For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of uncertainty. Mara wasn't what he expected. She was more than just a challenge. She was a force. This game, Ethan realized, might not be as simple as he had thought. Ethan watched Mara intently across the table. She wasn't intimidated by him, or the luxurious setting, something he found both intriguing and slightly unsettling. Mara was far from the women who usually filled his life, those who were easily charmed by his wealth and status. No, Mara seemed to be the opposite, exuding a quiet strength that Ethan hadn't anticipated. Their first meeting was shaping up to be different from any he had ever experienced. "So," Ethan began, leaning back in his chair, trying to regain control of the situation. "If you know about the bet, why are you here?" Mara took a sip of her water, her expression unreadable. "I have my reasons," she said coolly, meeting his gaze. "But let's be clear, Ethan. I'm not here for your money or your lifestyle. 6 months is 6 months, and when it's over, we go our separate ways." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her calm confidence. Most women would have been either excited or flustered by the idea of marrying a millionaire, even temporarily. But Mara? She was different. Ethan's mind raced, trying to figure out what her angle was. "So what do you want, Mara?" he asked, his tone shifting, more serious now. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "Freedom," she said simply. "I want you to understand that this marriage is just a formality. I have my own life, my own rules, and I won't be controlled by you or anyone else." For a moment, Ethan was silent. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Most people bent to his will, but Mara was like a brick wall. And yet, something about her defiance intrigued him. It wasn't just a challenge anymore, it was personal. "Fine," Ethan finally said, a slow smile spreading across his face. 6 months. After that, we go our separate ways." Mara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. It was clear that she didn't fully trust him, and why would she? She had accepted this challenge for reasons of her own, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she had a plan, something more than what she was letting on. Their conversation ended on a firm note. There were no pleasantries, no fake smiles or gestures. Mara stood, shook his hand once again, and left without looking back. Ethan sat there, watching her leave, his mind racing. This wasn't going to be as easy as he had thought. Days passed, and Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Mara. Her confidence, her independence, it was unlike anything he had encountered before. He was used to being in control, always one step ahead of everyone else. But with Mara, it felt like she was playing her own game, and that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. Their next meeting took place at a small, cozy cafe, Mara's choice, not his. Ethan, who was used to 5-star restaurants and exclusive venues, found himself feeling out of place. As he stepped inside, he spotted Mara already seated at a small table by the window, a cup of tea in front of her. "Interesting choice," Ethan remarked as he sat down, glancing around the humble setting. Mara smiled slightly, but her eyes held that same unwavering confidence. "Not everything needs to be extravagant, Ethan. Sometimes simplicity is better." Ethan wasn't sure if she was talking about the cafe or something else entirely, but he decided not to push the issue. Instead, they made small talk, discussing surface-level topics. But as always, Mara was the one to steer the conversation back to the point. "If we're really going through with this," Mara said, placing her cup of tea down firmly, "I want to make something clear. I'm not interested in your money, your penthouse, or your lifestyle. 6 months is 6 months, and when it's over, I'll walk away exactly the same as I entered." Ethan watched her carefully, his mind turning over her words. She was being completely honest, something rare in his world. Mara wasn't like the others, who saw marriage to a man like him as a way to climb the social ladder. She didn't want any part of his world, and that only made her more intriguing. "All right," Ethan agreed, leaning forward. "But you should know, Mara, that in my world 6 months is a long time. A lot can change." Mara met his gaze, her expression firm. "Not for me," she said simply. Their meeting ended on that note. Ethan left the cafe with a strange mix of excitement and frustration. He had never met anyone like Mara, someone who didn't seem to care about his wealth or his power. She wasn't playing by the rules he was used to, and that made her all the more interesting. The wedding was a stark contrast to Ethan's usual lifestyle. No grand ceremony, no extravagance, just a simple affair completed swiftly. To Ethan, it was a formality, another move in the game. But from the first day of their marriage, Mara made it clear that she wasn't playing by his rules. Right after the ceremony, Ethan took Mara to his luxurious skyline residence penthouse, high above the bustling city of Chicago. As they entered, he watched for a reaction, some sign of awe at the wealth displayed in every corner, the designer furniture, the panoramic city view, the art worth more than most homes. But Mara walked past it all with nothing more than a glance. She didn't seem impressed by the luxury or intimidated by his world, and her lack of reaction threw Ethan off guard. 6 months, Ethan, she said firmly, stopping at one of the massive windows overlooking the city. Not a day more. Her words were a reminder, a boundary he wasn't used to hearing. Ethan smiled, undeterred. He believed that with time, Mara would soften. He was confident she'd eventually enjoy the luxuries his world had to offer. After all, everyone else always had. But Mara was unyielding. In the days that followed, Ethan tried everything to impress her. Expensive jewelry appeared on her vanity, designer clothes filled a closet just for her, and spontaneous luxury trips were proposed at a moment's notice. But Mara refused it all. Every time, she would simply shake her head, saying, "I don't need these things, Ethan." For the first time, Ethan felt his influence slipping. He was accustomed to people bending to his will, yet Mara remained unmoved, grounded in her own independence. And that bothered him. He had never encountered anyone who so easily dismissed his world. One evening, frustrated by Mara's indifference, Ethan decided to take a more direct approach. "Why don't you understand, Mara? You don't have to work anymore, don't have to worry about anything," he said, exasperated. "You have everything you could ever want right here." But Mara looked at him with the same calm that he was beginning to resent. "Ethan," she replied, "money doesn't interest me, and it never has. I had a life before you, and I'll have a life after this arrangement. I don't need to be taken care of." Her words were like a slap, challenging everything he thought he knew about people. Mara was independent, a fortress he couldn't breach. No matter how much he tried, she wouldn't budge. Ethan's attempts to control her only seemed to make her more resolute. As his frustration grew, Ethan began to shift tactics, turning to subtle manipulation. He would arrange her schedule, delay her plans, and make it increasingly difficult for her to go to work, insisting she didn't need a job now that they were married. Mara saw through his tactics immediately. "I'm going to work, Ethan," she stated firmly one morning, brushing past him. "I know what you're trying to do, and it's not going to work." He tried holding her back, using every excuse in the book. But Mara remained unfazed, her resilience shining through each attempt he made. She wasn't just defying him, she was standing up to him in a way that no one had before. Each time she resisted, Ethan felt his grip on her, and his own emotions slipping. Ethan began to feel the stirrings of something he couldn't name. It wasn't just frustration, it was a kind of fascination. Mara was a force that he couldn't control, and her independence was challenging everything he knew about himself. For someone like Ethan, used to complete control, it was as if Mara was showing him a world he had never seen, a world where wealth and power had no influence. On one particularly tense day, Ethan tried a more emotional approach, hoping to break through her walls. "I don't understand you, Mara," he said, staring at her with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Any other woman would be thrilled to have all of this. They'd be happy to live in luxury, to let me take care of everything. But you act like it means nothing." Mara finally met his gaze, and there was a fire in her eyes that he hadn't expected. "What do I want, Ethan?" she replied, her voice steady. "I want respect. I'm not a piece on your chessboard. You think you can control me with money, but you're wrong. Money doesn't buy dignity or integrity. And it certainly doesn't buy me." Her words hit him hard, like a punch he hadn't seen coming. For the first time, Ethan felt vulnerable, exposed. Mara wasn't just resisting his influence, she was dismantling the facade he had built around himself. She saw through his wealth, his power, and the carefully constructed image he projected to the world. And that terrified him. Determined not to lose control, Ethan began to push harder, growing increasingly desperate. He started isolating Mara, subtly influencing her work relationships and even going so far as to cancel meetings and block connections that were important to her. He wanted her to see that without him, her life would be harder, that he was indispensable. But Mara was unyielding. With every attempt he made to restrict her, she found another way to push back. She kept her distance emotionally, refusing to let him get close. Ethan's efforts only seemed to strengthen her resolve, and he could see that she was not the type to back down easily. It wasn't long before their relationship felt like a battlefield, a minefield of provocations and subtle manipulations. Their arguments became sharper, and every interaction was charged with tension. Yet beneath the tension, Ethan began to feel something else, a growing admiration for her strength, her independence, her refusal to be controlled. One night, as Mara stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, Ethan found himself unable to look away. She was more than he had bargained for, and somewhere along the way, this game had become more than just a bet. Mara wasn't like anyone he had met before. She had become someone he respected, even admired. But respect wasn't enough to win her over, and Ethan knew it. His desperation to control was being replaced by something he couldn't yet understand, a desire to be close to her, not as a conqueror, but as a person. But after all he had done, he knew that breaking down the walls he had created around them would be a far greater challenge than he'd ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, the tension between Ethan and Mara only grew. The Skyline residence, once a symbol of Ethan's control and success, now felt stifling. Every conversation with Mara seemed like a clash of wills. She wouldn't yield, and Ethan was beginning to sense that his attempts to manipulate her only drove her further away. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to sway her with a grand gesture, Ethan confronted her directly. "I don't get you, Mara!" he blurted out, his frustration palpable. "What exactly do you want? Why did you even agree to this marriage if you're so determined to keep everything the same? Why bother?" Mara looked at him, her eyes calm but filled with a depth he couldn't quite reach. She took a breath, as if deciding whether to let her walls down. Then, with a resolve that chilled him, she spoke. "You think this marriage is about you, Ethan? That this whole arrangement is just some game you can play and win?" Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of anger beneath the surface. "Let me tell you why I agreed to this." Ethan stared at her, caught off guard by the intensity in her voice. For the first time, he felt that maybe he was the one being played. Mara continued, her gaze unwavering. "Years ago, my father was a man with his own small business. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and we were happy. He worked hard to build something he could be proud of. But then, people like you came along." Ethan's expression shifted, confusion giving way to unease. "What does that have to do with you, Ethan Brooks?" Mara interrupted, her voice cutting like ice. "Or rather, people just like you. Businessmen who saw small businesses as nothing more than opportunities to expand their empires. Your firm took over my father's company, stripped it for parts, and left us with nothing." Ethan felt a pang of recognition. His mind raced, fragments of memories surfacing, companies he'd bought out, lives disrupted in the name of growth and expansion. To him, they had always been just numbers on a spreadsheet. But now, faced with Mara's pain, he realized they were more than that. They were people. Families. Mara's voice trembled slightly as she continued. "My father lost everything. His company, his dream, his pride. He tried to fight, but he was no match for a corporation like yours. And as he struggled, our family fell apart. The man who once held us together was broken." She paused, her eyes glistening with restrained tears, but her voice held steady. "He took his own life, Ethan. He was too proud to tell us how bad things had gotten, and one day, he just didn't come home." Ethan's heart sank as her words struck him, each one heavier than the last. He had always known there were consequences to his ambition, but he had never faced them in such raw, human terms. Mara's father wasn't just collateral damage. He was a man who had lost everything because of people like Ethan. Mara took a steadying breath, visibly regaining her composure. "My mother and I were left with nothing, struggling to survive, to make sense of a world that had abandoned us. And while you sat here in your penthouse, enjoying your luxuries, we were barely getting by." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but he found he couldn't. What words could he possibly offer to someone whose life he'd irreparably damaged, even if indirectly? Mara's gaze hardened. So no, Ethan, I'm not here because of your money. I'm not here because I want your help or your sympathy. I agreed to this marriage to remind myself of people like you. To remember why I fight so hard to stay independent, why I refuse to be manipulated by men who think they can control everything around them. For a long moment, silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Ethan could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, each sentence unraveling the carefully constructed persona he had spent years building. Mara's words had shattered his illusion of control, leaving him vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Mara, I didn't know. I didn't know any of this. She looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. Of course you didn't. People like you never see the lives you destroy. You're too busy climbing your way to the top to notice the people you've trampled beneath you. The harsh reality of her words hit Ethan like a blow. He was, for the first time, forced to confront the moral cost of his ambition. To him, the success of his empire had always been a testament to his skill and intelligence, but to Mara, it was a symbol of loss, of suffering, of a life destroyed. Ethan took a deep, shaky breath. I'm sorry, he said, his voice raw and unfamiliar even to himself. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never thought. I never realized. But Mara simply shook her head. Sorry doesn't change anything, Ethan. Sorry doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't erase the years of pain we went through, or the nights my mother and I lay awake, wondering how we'd make it to the next day. Ethan felt a sharp pang of guilt and regret. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to understand and control them, but with Mara, he was lost. She was a reminder of everything he'd taken for granted, of every life he'd disrupted in his relentless pursuit of success. Trying to steady himself, Ethan looked at her, his voice barely steady. I know I can't change the past, Mara, but maybe I can make things right now. Mara's expression softened slightly, but her resolve was unbroken. I don't want anything from you, Ethan. I'm not here for redemption or closure. I'm here to remind you that people like me exist. People whose lives were shattered by men who think they're untouchable. Ethan felt a strange ache in his chest, a pain he wasn't used to. This wasn't a business deal he could fix or a game he could win. Mara was forcing him to see himself for who he really was, flaws, failures, and all. It was a confrontation he had avoided for years, buried under layers of wealth and power. But now, he couldn't hide. Not from her, and not from himself. The days following Mara's revelation were a blur of thoughts and guilt for Ethan. He couldn't escape the feeling that everything he had once prided himself on was built upon the ruins of others. Every luxurious corner of his penthouse now seemed to remind him of the lives he'd disrupted, the families he'd overlooked. Mara's words echoed relentlessly in his mind, casting a shadow over everything he'd once celebrated as a success. For the first time, Ethan began to review his past with a sense of regret he had never known. As he looked back, faces started emerging from the deals he'd made, deals he had once thought were just numbers, contracts, and transactions. Yet these weren't just figures on a spreadsheet. They were people, with dreams, families, lives. And now he saw them all through Mara's eyes, with an awareness that felt both devastating and inescapable. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Skyline residence, staring out over the city lights. Those lights had once symbolized power and triumph for him, but now they only seemed to illuminate the emptiness that wealth had brought into his life. As the silence closed in, he felt a hollowness he hadn't acknowledged before, a gap where empathy should have been. As he stood there, he recalled his younger self, ambitious and eager, yet reckless. He remembered the nights he'd stayed late at the office, chasing the next big deal, convincing himself that this was how success was meant to look. He told himself that this was normal, that the sacrifices were necessary. But now, through the lens of Mara's pain, those deals felt cold and merciless. A memory surfaced of a small family-owned company he'd taken over years ago. The owner, a man whose name he barely remembered, had pleaded with him to keep the business intact, to protect the employees who had been with him for decades. Ethan had ignored the pleas, shutting down the company and absorbing the assets, leaving dozens jobless in a city with few opportunities. At the time, it had felt like a triumph, a win in his relentless pursuit of power. But now, he couldn't shake the image of that man's desperate face, the way he'd held back tears as he signed away his life's work. Ethan's chest tightened with a new, unfamiliar feeling, remorse. This wasn't just about Mara's family. It was about everyone he'd ever harmed in his blind chase for success. For the first time, Ethan realized that his ambition had a dark side, one he could no longer ignore. Mara had forced him to confront the truth about himself, and that truth was unsettling, painful. Ethan took a shaky breath, knowing that he couldn't change the past but desperate to find a way to make amends. He was beginning to understand that wealth and power weren't enough to fill the emptiness within him. He wanted more than just redemption. He wanted to become someone worthy of respect, someone who wouldn't have hurt people like Mara's father. But as he stared at his own reflection in the glass, he wondered if that kind of transformation was even possible. As Ethan wrestled with his past and the weight of his actions, Mara was quietly making her own moves. She hadn't come into this marriage for revenge, but the more she saw Ethan struggling, the more she felt compelled to remind him of the pain his decisions had caused. Her reminders weren't loud or confrontational. They were subtle, silent blows that forced Ethan to confront the man he had been. Every morning, Mara would rise early, leaving the penthouse without a word, returning to her own life and work. She refused any help from him, showing him that she neither needed nor wanted anything he could offer. When she interacted with him, she was cold, distant, her words few, her gaze unwavering. Ethan felt the chill of her indifference more deeply than he could have anticipated, as though he were a stranger in his own home. One day, as Ethan arrived at a crucial meeting, he discovered that some of his major clients had withdrawn their contracts without explanation. His usually reliable business network began faltering in subtle ways, meetings cancelled, key negotiations delayed. It didn't take him long to realize that Mara had been in contact with some of the people in his professional circle, gently nudging them to reevaluate their partnerships with him. She wasn't destroying him financially. She was dismantling his security, little by little, making him feel the instability he had once imposed on others. The realization unsettled him. For someone who had spent his life carefully controlling every aspect of his empire, this newfound vulnerability was jarring. Ethan found himself hesitating, uncertain in a world where he had once been invincible. Mara was showing him, with calculated precision, how it felt to be at the mercy of someone else's decisions. But the most painful blow came in the simplest moments. At breakfast, Mara would sit across from him in silence, hardly acknowledging his presence, barely meeting his eyes. She would speak warmly with the staff, but with him, her words were clipped, her voice emotionless. Her silence was a sharp, unspoken rebuke, a reminder of her father's silence, the silence that had filled her life after he was gone. One evening, Ethan tried to reach out. "Mara," he began, his voice quiet but filled with remorse. "I know I can't change what happened. But please, let me try to make things right." Mara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Make things right?" she echoed, her tone laced with bitterness. "Ethan, you still think this is something you can fix? That's the problem." Her words were like a blade, cutting into the heart of his guilt. She rose from her seat and left him sitting alone, the silence of the room pressing down on him, heavier than any punishment he could have imagined. In those quiet moments, Ethan began to understand that Mara's coldness, her indifference, was her way of showing him the depths of her pain. She didn't need to raise her voice or make grand gestures. Her silent contempt was enough to make him question every step he'd taken to build his empire, every person he'd disregarded on his way to the top. The more he felt her distance, the more he realized that wealth and power had shielded him from the true impact of his actions. Now, stripped of the security he'd once relied upon, Ethan was left facing the person he had been, and the person he desperately wanted to become. The weight of Mara's silent contempt became a relentless presence in Ethan's life. Her indifference had broken through his once untouchable confidence, and every quiet interaction only deepened his realization of the harm he'd caused. But with this newfound awareness came a burning desire to make amends. Ethan knew he couldn't undo the past, but he was determined to begin his journey of redemption, no matter how long it took. One morning, as Mara prepared to leave the penthouse, Ethan stopped her at the door. His face was resolute, yet softened by vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Mara," he said, his voice steady, "I know I can't change what happened, and I know I can't erase your pain. But I want to try to make things right, not just for you, but for everyone I've hurt along the way." Mara met his gaze, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something almost like surprise. She didn't respond, but Ethan took her silence as a sign to continue. That day, Ethan began taking steps he never considered before. He arranged meetings with former business owners whose companies he had once acquired ruthlessly. He sat across from these people, listened to their stories, and for the first time, he found himself asking for their forgiveness, not as a wealthy CEO, but as a man who recognized his mistakes. At one of these meetings, he met a woman named Linda Moreno, who had lost her small business to one of Ethan's corporate takeovers years ago. She was hesitant to see him, her face a mixture of bitterness and wariness. "I don't understand why you're here, Ethan," she said, her tone sharp. "You've taken everything from people like me. What could you possibly want now?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pang of shame. "Linda, I'm not here to justify what I did. I know I can't give back what you lost. But I'm here to apologize. I realize now how much harm I've caused in the name of success, and I want to find a way to help, if you'll let me." Linda looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. "Apologies don't pay bills, Ethan," she replied quietly. "But maybe actions can." She handed him a list of local businesses struggling to survive, businesses Ethan's corporation could easily support if he truly intended to make a difference. Ethan took the list with a nod, a sense of purpose filling him. This wasn't just about Mara anymore, it was about rebuilding something meaningful, something he could be proud of. He began working on initiatives to support these businesses, setting up funds to help struggling owners, and even creating job opportunities for those he had once displaced. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued his efforts, slowly rebuilding his integrity, piece by piece. Mara watched him quietly, her expression unreadable, but Ethan sensed that she was observing the sincerity of his actions. He knew he couldn't win her forgiveness with grand gestures. He could only show her, through patience and consistency, that he was a changed man. One evening, as they sat across from each other in the living room, Ethan spoke up, his voice hesitant but honest. "Mara," he began, "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know that meeting you has changed everything. You showed me who I really am, and for that, I owe you more than I can ever repay." Mara was silent for a long moment, her gaze softened, though her walls remained firm. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice measured, "change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But I can see that you're trying. Maybe in time, that's a start." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope, a flicker of possibility that Ethan hadn't dared to believe he could reach. As they sat together in that quiet moment, he realized that he was no longer fighting to control Mara or to win a bet. He was fighting to become someone worthy of respect, someone who could stand before her without shame. And as they parted ways for the night, Ethan knew that this journey of redemption would be long and difficult. But for the first time, he felt ready to face it, determined to become a better man, not just for Mara, but for everyone he'd wronged. And perhaps, one day, he would find himself worthy of the forgiveness he now sought. As the days passed, Mara couldn't ignore the quiet but steady transformation unfolding before her eyes. Ethan had always been a man of grand gestures and undeniable confidence, but now, his actions were different. His energy had shifted. Where arrogance once ruled, humility had taken its place. Mara watched him make his daily efforts to right his past wrongs, and even though she held back, she couldn't deny the depth of his commitment. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Mara returned to the penthouse to find a small note from Ethan on the kitchen counter. In it, he'd simply written, "I know I can never fix the pain I caused, but I'll never stop trying. Thank you for showing me the truth." It wasn't an apology laden with excuses. It was raw, honest, and most surprisingly, heartfelt. Mara stood there, holding the note, a strange warmth stirring within her. Ethan was no longer the cold, detached businessman she had once known. Gradually, their interactions became less tense. Ethan no longer tried to control her schedule or make demands on her time. Instead, he'd quietly prepare her favorite tea in the mornings, leaving it on the table without expecting a word. Mara didn't acknowledge it at first, but over time, she began to feel a flicker of appreciation. His gestures weren't grand, they were small and thoughtful, signs of a man genuinely trying to connect. One afternoon, as Mara was getting ready to leave for work, she saw Ethan carefully arranging donations for a local charity that supported struggling small businesses, the very kinds of businesses he had once dismantled. She paused at the doorway, watching him thoughtfully. He looked up, surprised to see her there, but he didn't speak, waiting for her response. Mara hesitated, then finally broke the silence. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost as if she didn't want to disrupt the moment. Ethan nodded. "I have to," he replied, his voice just as quiet. "I can't live with myself otherwise. I know I've hurt people who will never forgive me, but I have to do everything I can to make amends." Mara didn't respond immediately, but she nodded slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of his efforts. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a small crack in the wall she had built between them. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan continued his journey. Mara noticed how he spoke differently, how he no longer boasted about his success but instead talked about the people he met, the small business owners, the families, the employees who had once been just numbers to him. He shared stories of his conversations with these people, each one marking a step in his journey of self-awareness. The way he spoke about them, with a mixture of respect and remorse, made her see that his change wasn't a performance. It was real. One evening, after they had shared a quiet dinner, Mara found herself opening up to Ethan for the first time. She told him stories about her father, about how he had been a man of integrity, someone who valued people above profits, a stark contrast to the life Ethan had once lived. Ethan listened intently, his face softening with every word. "I see now why he meant so much to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think if I'd met him, I would have respected him. Maybe even admired him." Mara looked at him, a faint sadness in her eyes. "You would have," she replied softly. "And maybe he would have respected the person you're trying to become now." For the first time, a sense of mutual respect settled between them. It was fragile, tentative, but it was real. Mara saw that Ethan was no longer just a man she had married for a bet. He was someone who was struggling, fighting to become better, and that struggle brought them closer, piece by piece. In small moments, she began to let her guard down, allowing herself to see beyond the pain Ethan had caused. She still felt the weight of her past, the loss of her father, but she found herself hoping, against all odds, that maybe Ethan's journey could bring some healing not only for him but also for her. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Ethan hesitated, then spoke up. "Mara," he began, his voice soft, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if there's ever a chance, I hope you'll see me for who I am now, not who I was." Mara looked at him, her gaze steady but gentler than it had been in months. "Change takes time, Ethan," she replied quietly. "But I can see that you're trying. And maybe that's a start." In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They weren't enemies, and they weren't just two strangers bound by a contract anymore. They were two people, each carrying their own scars, yet finding a shared space where growth and healing might just be possible. And as the evening drew on, Mara couldn't help but wonder if, After all the walls she had built to protect herself, she might just find it in her heart to forgive Ethan one day. Perhaps, she thought, the man she had resented for so long was becoming someone she could respect, someone who understood the depth of her pain and the true value of redemption. Ethan knew he had to be honest with Mara, more so than he had ever been with anyone, including himself. One evening, after a quiet dinner together, he found himself unable to keep his feelings buried any longer. The moments they had shared over recent months, from the tension-filled arguments to the rare, quiet conversations, had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. He was no longer the man who viewed love as a game or marriage as a transaction. What he felt for Mara was real, far deeper than any passing infatuation. Taking a deep breath, Ethan gathered his thoughts, feeling an unusual sense of vulnerability. "Mara," he began, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I need you to know something. This journey started as a challenge for me, something I took on out of arrogance and pride. But along the way, it's become more than that. You've changed me, Mara. You've made me see parts of myself I didn't want to face. And I've come to care for you in ways I can't ignore anymore." Mara's expression remained steady, but he could see a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She hadn't expected this confession, and neither, truthfully, had he. He continued, feeling a swell of emotions he had tried so hard to suppress. "What I'm trying to say is that I love you, Mara. And not because of the bet, or because I want to win you over. I love you for the person you are, strong, fearless, and so much more than I could ever deserve." The words hung in the air, filling the space between them. Mara looked at him in silence, her gaze softened but still guarded. For the first time, Ethan wasn't sure what her response would be. His heart pounded in his chest, raw and exposed, as he waited, wondering if his confession would be met with acceptance or quiet rejection. "I know I don't deserve you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I want you to know that my feelings for you are real, and they'll remain, no matter what you decide." Mara's silence stretched on, but this time, Ethan didn't try to fill it. He had said all he needed to say. And for once, he left the decision entirely in her hands, ready to accept whatever answer she would give. Mara sat quietly, absorbing Ethan's words. His confession lingered in her mind, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She had never expected this man, the same one who had once represented everything she despised, to reveal a heart so raw, so vulnerable. But as she looked at him now, she saw a changed man, someone who was genuinely trying to be better, not for a reward, but because he wanted to be worthy. A part of her hesitated. She had guarded herself for so long, her walls built high and fortified with years of pain and disappointment. Ethan had caused her unimaginable suffering, even if he hadn't known it at the time. Could she really trust him, allow herself to be vulnerable again? As she sat there, Mara recalled the journey she had seen Ethan undertake, the humble meetings with those he had once wronged, his quiet acts of kindness, his willingness to listen without defensiveness. These weren't the actions of a man seeking forgiveness out of guilt alone. They were the steps of someone striving for redemption, someone willing to face every painful truth to earn her respect. Slowly she looked up, her gaze meeting his. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I won't lie to you. Trusting you doesn't come easily to me. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget the pain, or completely forgive everything that happened." Ethan nodded, his expression one of quiet acceptance. He had prepared himself for this. He knew the road he had set on was long and uncertain, and that forgiveness, if it came, would be hard-won. "But," Mara continued, her voice softening, "I see that you're different now. You've shown me that people can change, even if it takes facing the hardest parts of themselves. And maybe it's time I let myself believe in that change." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth, but he stayed silent, allowing her to finish. "I'm not promising a clean slate," Mara said, her eyes serious. "But if you're willing to keep trying, then I'm willing to take that chance. Maybe we can build something new. Not because of a bet, but because it's what we both want." Ethan's face softened, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over him. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was the beginning of something real, a chance to create a relationship founded on mutual respect, patience, and a shared commitment to move forward. In the weeks that followed Mara's cautious acceptance, their relationship began to take on a new shape. It was a slow, steady process. Ethan respected her boundaries, showing his commitment not through grand gestures but through quiet, consistent actions. For the first time, they started sharing small, personal moments, enjoying cups of coffee together, taking walks in the city, and exchanging stories about their pasts. There was no rushing, no forcing of feelings. Each moment was genuine, grounded in the understanding that they were building something from scratch. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from the balcony of the Skyline residence, Mara turned to Ethan with a hesitant smile. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice soft but steady. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, worry flickering in his eyes. "What is it, Mara?" he asked, reaching out to take her hand gently, as if to reassure her that he was there for whatever she needed to share. Mara took a deep breath, her hand resting lightly on her stomach. "I wasn't sure at first," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Ethan's face was a mix of shock and amazement. His eyes widened, processing the weight of her revelation. Then, slowly, a radiant smile spread across his face, and his gaze softened as he looked at her with a depth of emotion he could hardly put into words. "Mara, we're having a child?" he whispered, his voice thick with joy. Mara nodded, her own smile hesitant yet hopeful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they held each other in a shared embrace, feeling a sense of unity they had never known before. It was as if the struggles and the hurt they had endured had led them to this single, profound moment, one filled with hope, renewal, and the promise of a new beginning. Ethan's heart swelled with a fierce determination. This child would be their chance to start fresh, to build a family based on love, honesty, and understanding. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but now, with Mara by his side and a family to look forward to, he felt ready to face whatever came their way. "I'll be here, Mara," he said softly, holding her close. "For you, for our child, and for every moment we have ahead. I know I can't change the past, but I promise I'll spend every day trying to be the man you deserve." Mara's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him, seeing in his gaze a love that was real, a love that had been tested and had grown stronger. "We'll do this together, Ethan," she whispered. "Not because of what happened before, but because of who we've both become." As they stood there, the night settling around them, Mara and Ethan realized they had finally found something lasting, a love born not from perfection, but from resilience, forgiveness, and the courage to start anew. As the months passed, Ethan and Mara's relationship grew stronger, grounded in honesty and mutual respect. Their quiet, everyday routines took on new significance. They were no longer just two people navigating a complex arrangement, but partners preparing for the future, a family forming with each passing day. The penthouse, once a place of distance and tension, had become a warm sanctuary, filled with small, shared moments that bound them closer. One evening, after setting up a small corner of the penthouse as a nursery, Ethan turned to Mara, his eyes bright with joy and gratitude. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted softly, reaching out to hold her hand. "A family, a real chance to be the man I should have been all along. I don't know what I did to deserve this second chance, but I promise I'll never take it for granted." Mara looked at him, her own heart filled with a quiet happiness she hadn't felt in years. "It wasn't an easy road, Ethan," she replied, her voice gentle but sincere. "And there were times I thought it was impossible for us to get here. But you've shown me that people can change if they're willing to face their own mistakes. I didn't give you this second chance, you earned it." Ethan took her words to heart, feeling the depth of her trust settle within him. It was a trust he had fought for step by step, a trust he would do anything to protect. He knew that their journey was far from over, that there would be challenges ahead, but he felt ready to face them, knowing Mara was by his side. As they sat together, imagining the life they would soon be sharing with their child. Ethan felt a surge of determination. He wanted to be a father who would make his child proud, a man who would inspire them to be kind, strong, and compassionate. His legacy would no longer be measured by wealth or success, but by the love and respect he showed his family and those around him. In a quiet moment, Mara placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the subtle movement of their child. She smiled, looking at Ethan with a warmth that had taken so long to build but felt entirely natural now. This child will grow up in a home filled with love, with two parents who've learned what it means to fight for each other and forgive, she said softly, her words carrying a promise of their own. And that's because of the changes you've made. Ethan reached for her hand, his heart filled with gratitude and humility. Thank you, Mara, he murmured. Thank you for giving me this chance. I know I can't change the past, but I'll do everything I can to make our future something beautiful. As the night settled around them, they spoke about the dreams they held for their family. They imagined the little things, the laughter, the late-night stories, the small milestones that would fill their lives with joy. And in that moment, surrounded by the hopes and dreams they had built together, Ethan knew that his journey of redemption was not just for Mara or for their child, but also for himself. For the first time, he felt complete, whole in a way he had never known. With Mara's forgiveness and the promise of their family, he had found something worth more than any success or wealth he could have ever achieved. It was a second chance not only to live differently, but to truly understand the meaning of love and resilience. As they held each other, silently basking in the warmth of their shared dreams, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The future lay open before them, and they were ready to face it together, stronger and more united than ever. As their story unfolded, Ethan and Mara built a life grounded not in material wealth, but in the strength of their love, resilience, and a shared commitment to a better future. Their journey showed that true redemption isn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It's about consistent growth, humility, and the courage to face the person you were and the person you strive to become. In time, they welcomed a child into their lives, a symbol of their shared hope and renewed purpose. Their home became filled with laughter, quiet moments, and a sense of peace they had both longed for. Ethan, once driven by ambition alone, found fulfillment in being a loving partner and a devoted father. And Mara, once burdened by grief and loss, found healing in the family they had created together, in the man Ethan had worked so hard to become. Ethan and Mara's story reminds us that the past doesn't have to define our future. We all make mistakes, some of which we regret deeply, but it is never too late to make amends. True change requires time, honesty, and a willingness to face hard truths, but the reward is a life built on genuine respect, trust, and love. For anyone who has felt wronged or betrayed, let this story be a reminder that forgiveness, while difficult, is one of the most powerful gifts we can give ourselves and others. And for those who carry the weight of past mistakes, remember that redemption isn't out of reach. Each day is a new opportunity to change, to grow, and to earn back the trust and love of those around us. If this story resonated with you, we hope it serves as a reminder that life is a journey, one that is often defined by second chances. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspectives mean so much to us. And if you found value in this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of transformation and hope. Thank you for watching, and remember, every day is an opportunity to start anew.